Good evening, good evening. Welcome to our third and final 2021 Edinburgh Festival Fringe online event. Our usual format is a talk followed by Q&A, so please type your questions in the YouTube chat, tweet hashtag #EdSkeptics, or even email us at inbox@edskeptics.co.uk, and we will try and ask your questions to Meirion at the end. So for those of you joining us for the first time, a very warm welcome. My name is Sean Slater, and along with my colleagues Mark and Heather Pentler, we currently manage Edinburgh Skeptics. In normal times, we put on live events in the city promoting science, skepticism, and critical thinking. We work with the PBH Free Fringe to bring 23 free live events as part of the Fringe. And of course, because of COVID, we're online, and so we've just done a few events this year. This evening, though, it gives me a huge pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Meirion Jones. I first heard Meirion speak at the QED conference a few years ago when he talked about the expose he'd done on fake bomb detectors, which were based on souped-up dowsing rods that have been sold for thousands of dollars in war-torn regions of the world. We said then we'd love to get him to do a talk for us, and we've managed to do so for tonight. Meirion is an investigative journalist who won the Daniel Pearl Award for his investigation of Trafigura's toxic dumping. He was also awarded with Scoop of the Year for Jimmy Savile. He now runs investigations at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, which has revealed Deliveroo's poverty wages, beef companies' role in deforesting the Amazon, how the Met Police let an alleged rapist carry on serving, and how poor countries are missing out on COVID vaccines. His work has appeared in almost every paper, national and local in the UK, and in media outlets across 90 countries around the world. So please give a very warm welcome to Meirion Jones.
Hi, I'm Meirion. I'm glad you've turned up, and I will be dealing with bogus bomb detectors, but I'll do that quite briefly. I think a lot of you know that story, but I will be getting out the briefcase of doom a little bit later and get a chance to see remotely these wonderful $10,000 and $40,000 detectors. But I thought I would start with something much older. So just down the road from you in a couple of months, we're going to have the COP26 conference. And I go back to a time where the world was faced with an environmental disaster facing us because of chemicals that humans had released into the atmosphere, that industry had released into the atmosphere. Very similar in a way to what we're facing now, but then it was CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, which were creating an ozone hole. And a lot of people are very depressed at the moment and thinking, what on earth can we do about global warming? We can't solve this. You know, we're all going to die. Well, we are all going to die eventually anyhow. But there was a similar mood then about the ozone hole, and industry was saying, you know, we can't find any alternatives. It's going to take years for us to develop them. Even then, it'll take years and years to safety test all this stuff. You know, the ozone layer is going to be destroyed before we can do anything about it. And the interesting thing was, and I'm just going to share my screen, which is a very old article from New Scientist that I wrote in 1988. When I was investigating what the options were. And one of the lessons I learned from that is not to deal with big companies and assume they're monoliths. So ICI and DuPont were the two big CFC makers who are, ICI still at that point, trying to stop any regulation, any curb on CFCs. But within them, I found a group that were working on the alternatives. And they had a different agenda. Now, whether that was because they wanted to save the world, or whether it was because they thought they'd get paid a lot more money if their alternatives became the main product, or, you know, for whatever reason, once I started talking to them, they told me some really useful information. And what I found was that the alternatives had already been developed. They'd even been already safety tested back in the 70s, when they thought there were going to be fleets of supersonic aircraft like Concorde, and the only way they'd be allowed to fly and the damage they would do to the ozone layer if CFCs were stopped. So in fact, although they weren't admitting it, they were almost ready to go with the alternatives. And I do think that with the crisis we're facing at the moment, it's a very similar situation, that there's an awful lot of stuff out there that can be done, that industry knows can be done, which they're sitting on for as long as they can until there's enough pressure on them from governments and from people. So going back to our present crisis, I'll just take that slide down now. Going back to our present crisis, I want to talk about the deforestation in the Amazon, which is something we do a lot on. And we've worked a lot on a company called JBS. They're the biggest beef company in the world, and they are responsible for a lot of the rainforest deforestation. They don't bulldoze it themselves. They buy cattle from the ranchers who bulldoze the rainforest. And because they keep buying the cattle, the rainforest keeps being destroyed. And they own all sorts of things. They own Pilgrim's Pride in America. They own Moy Park, which is one of the biggest chicken producers in Britain. They're everywhere. So this is the photo they'd like you to see. I'm just going to share my screen now. This is the head of JBS. His two predecessors were in and out of prison. They bribed 4 different Brazilian presidents. They're involved in all manner of scandals, from dirty meat to bribery. And this is the current head of JBS with Alok Sharma, the president of COP26. And they're doing a nice little fist bump. And we get the impression that JBS are these wonderful people who are committed to saving the environment and stopping climate change. Now I'm going to get rid of that photo. And in a minute, I'm going to show you a photo that they don't want you to see. And this photo is a photo that came off Facebook. So I'm going to share my screen now. And you can see it's a JBS truck. And it was one of their drivers. Strange how stories come to you sometimes. One of their drivers posted on Facebook pictures of his truck, where he was, etc. And what we were able to do through geolocation, etc., was work out where the ranch was that he was visiting, where he was picking up the cattle. That ranch was an illegally deforested ranch. So this is JBS sending their own trucks to pick up cattle from illegally deforested areas of the Amazon. And we were then able to correlate that with cattle transfer records. So we could see that the cattle had then been bought from there and shipped by JBS to one of its, if you like, laundering ranches. They then have ranches which are supposedly clean. So they take the dirty cattle, they move them to the clean ranch, and then they move them from the clean ranch to the abattoir, where they claim that the cattle has come from a clean source. So in this case, you know, as I say, mixture of geolocation and cattle records, we were able to show that JBS are actually shipping these cattle out of the deforested Amazon. And some of those cattle end up as corned beef in Sainsbury's. The Co-op have stopped buying it now, but you can actually buy products in British stores which are coming from illegally deforested areas of the Amazon. So that's one way that you can get a story. You can get a story off Facebook, you know, that by tracking down, you know, we're covering everything that JBS do. We look at everything that they are doing. And therefore you pick this up, and then you have your teams who can get onto that, find all the records that go with it. They can show the maps and so on of the Amazon, work out exactly where it's come from, and look at the deforestation. I want to go to like a completely different area. I'm just going to take this off screen. And another weird way that you can get a story. And one of the stories we put a lot of time into a couple of years ago was homelessness. And I'll just put that, share my screen now. So one of our reporters, Maeve, went off to find out how many homeless people die each year in Britain. And she couldn't find out. And there must have been 100 journalists who'd done that before her, tried to find that out. You can't find out. Nobody keeps the figures. Nobody keeps the numbers. But instead of just going away, she came and talked to me and Rachel, my boss, and she said, is that a story? That nobody counts homeless deaths? Is that the story? And should we do something about it? Should we count the deaths? And we did that for over a year, and hundreds of homeless people were dying unrecorded. Now, obviously, our purpose in doing that was to draw attention to the problem of homelessness and the hopelessly inadequate provision that we make. But at the end of that period, the National Statistical Office and the Scottish equivalent said, you know what, we should be counting these deaths. And they started counting the deaths of homeless people. That's only a little thing. It's a little thing that you can do. But in a way, you're saying these people do count and we should count them. But obviously what you're trying to do is trying to make sure that less homeless people die. Where shall I go next? Here's another way that you can get a story. A story we did with the New York Times. And let me just see if I can pull this up. I'll just get rid of what I've got on my screen at the moment, which has managed to get slightly disorganized. And I tell you what, I'm actually going to switch then. I'll switch to something completely different just to make life easy for myself. I'm going to talk about the bogus bomb detectors. So this is the $40,000 bogus bomb detector. This is the $10,000 bogus bomb detector. And this story first emerged in November 2009, when Rod Nordland, who was a New York Times reporter in Baghdad, reported that the Americans thought these detectors didn't work. And Caroline Hawley, who was our Baghdad reporter, who was back in London, came down to see me outraged and said, we must do something about this. I thought that the Iraqis or the British would suspend the use of the bomb detectors pretty quickly. But what actually happened was that a month later, there was another huge wave of bombings in Baghdad. These were the bomb detectors which the Iraqi forces were using. Over 100 people were killed in another wave of bombings. And at that point, we started working flat out on trying to find out how we could prove that these detectors didn't work. And one of my colleagues, who was a local reporter, managed to track down the guy behind this. And he gave a very strange interview with his back to camera, where he made more outrageous claims that they could detect explosives at a kilometre away. And we, meanwhile, tried to get some sense out of the Ministry of Defence, out of the Foreign Office, out of the Department of Business as to why on earth this was carrying on. And they all said to us, unless you can prove that they don't work, we can't do anything about this, which seemed bizarre to us. And there was a press conference in Baghdad where Mr. McCormick, who was the supposed inventor of these detectors, appeared. And they did a ridiculous presentation where they put a hand grenade in open sight on a table, and a soldier equipped with one of these detected the hand grenade. The aerial, which is all it is, a car aerial, swung towards the grenade, therefore detecting the grenade. And what it told me was that the Iraqi general who was running the press conference was in on this. There is no way that an Iraqi general did not know that these were fake bomb detectors. It turned out that he'd been given $1 million bribe by McCormick in order to endorse his product. All this time, Iraqis are dying all around. Maybe 2,000 Iraqis died because of this scam. And we were just working and working away, and you're trying everything. And you're trying to reach out, hoping to find people who can help you. And you try every way you can. And we're talking to people like Bruce Hood, who many of you will know from the Skeptics movement. We're talking to all sorts of different people. And eventually, a guy who worked in a plastics factory came to us, and he did the usual thing that people have seen films about investigative journalism do. He insisted that we meet at a London railway terminus so he could hand over what he had to us anonymously. And what he handed over were the cards that went into these devices that were supposedly the detector cards. And these cards just look like this. And if you look against them against a very strong light, you can see something that looks like an electronic circuit in the middle of them. And he said to us that although they claimed to be detecting different things, he was sure that the same circuits were being put in every card. Therefore, they couldn't have anything on them that detected anything. And we thought at that point that they would turn out to have something like a Space Invaders game or something like that on there. That there would be information on those cards, but it would be something completely spurious. So we went to the Cambridge Computer Laboratory, got them to open them up, have a look, see if there was any information on them. And at the end of that, when we came to the end of that process, the Cambridge Computer Laboratory told us that all that was in these cards were shop anti-theft tags. So there was no possible information on those tags at all. It was just the cheapest flat bit of electronics that would fit in a card and look like electronics. They're worth, maybe a penny each, these cards. And yet they were supposedly the active ingredient of a $40,000 bomb detector. Now, armed with that information, we were then able to go back to the government. And we said, we're running this story on Friday night. You've got till then to do something about this. And they protested, and the MOD said it was Biz, and Biz said it was the Foreign Office, and they went round and round. And then on the Friday at lunchtime, we put out the story online, and we were going to go big on the 6 o'clock news on this, and then devote the whole of Newsnight to it. And what happened was that about 20 to 6, we were contacted by, it was Mandelson in those days, who was in charge of business. And he said, I am banning the export of these devices immediately on the basis of your tests, etc. And we got them to ban them. Obviously, it led the 6 o'clock news then. But it took years more to get them to jail, because there were people in government who had supported this, who had played along with it, and not for bribes in Britain, but just because, they wanted to help the defense industry or whatever. And it took years to get them in jail, but when they did, the leader got sentenced to 10 years in prison. He's out now, sadly. He made $85 million from the Iraq contract. The actual cost of all the detectors and everything else would have been less than $1 million. That's $84 million profit. He split that with the people he bribed in Iraq and the Middle East in order to get these accepted. And he had all the status symbols, a yacht, houses in several countries, the whole works. So I suppose that's an example of where you can find a scientific test that you can do on something to prove that it is false. That's why it's very much in the areas of the skeptical movement and so on. So I'm just watching the clock ticking. I think I'm going to go to something completely different, which is the fake shake. I'm just going to play you in a minute, not quite yet, once I've got it set up.
In exposing the secrets of the rich and famous.
Stop this. So this is a panorama that I made about the fake sheikh, Mazza Mahmood, which led to him going to prison, really. And And he was a very high-profile journalist who did all sorts of stings, most of which were completely bogus, and an awful lot of innocent people went to prison or had their lives ruined as a result. Now, I had a lot of flack coming in the run-in to this program from decent journalists saying, you can't turn over another journalist, it'll make us all look bad. But that wasn't my view. I mean, my view is that, you just have to go for the story. And, this guy was a disgrace to journalism, and, he needed to be turned over. So I'm just going to share my screen now. This is the title card of the panorama. It goes to black 3 seconds before transmission. And as you can see, the clock is counting down. We made this film in 2014, not long before I left the BBC. I'll just show you the top of it.
This is a man who doesn't want you to see his face. Mazza Mahmood went to court to stop Panorama showing you pictures like this.
I'll give you a shout. That's gone a job now. I'll give you a shout.
Posing as a fake sheikh, the News of the World reporter delighted in exposing the secrets of the rich and famous. Dozens of people were sent to jail following his undercover stings.
I never killed anyone, but it feels like I've served a life sentence.
Now Mazza Mahmood stands accused of being a liar.
Mazza Mahmood was Pinocchio on speed. It was so easy for him to fit anybody up.
Okay, I'll pull out that there. So I'd had my eye on Mazza Mahmood for some time, and then Talisa, the pop star, ended up in court as the result of one of Mazza Mahmood's stings. And most celebrities did a deal with the Murdoch press in order to avoid that. They would do a confession, they would admit to things. She stood her ground, and as the trial proceeded, it became obvious that Mazza Mahmood had lied and invented evidence. And the judge ultimately had enough and basically called out Mazza Mahmood and stopped the trial. Now, at that point, I started contacting, with a colleague of mine, Owen Phillips, some of the people who'd been turned over the years, people who wouldn't talk. And we said, look, this is the moment. Talisa now has called him out. The judge has called him a liar. This is the moment to do an interview. And very quickly, people started coming over. And the other thing we had was his henchmen. Mazza Mahmood was so vile to the people he worked with that most of his henchmen who'd recorded the secret filming and so on over the years ended up working for us and helping us. And one in particular, the guy who was talking about Pinocchio on speed there with the red top, he had the original tapes of lots of the stings from back in the 90s. So these were obviously on VHSs, they were bad quality, we had to clean them up, we had to get the sound cleaned up. But they showed incontrovertibly that what the paper had claimed, the News of the World claimed had happened, had not happened. That these were fake, that these were stings, that people had been coerced or maneuvered into doing things that were bad on camera. And we were then able to run a half-hour panorama, or we thought we were getting in the position to do that, which is when we started getting the incoming. Because that's the other thing about being an investigative journalist, you get a lot of incoming. So as we prepare to put out a story, we give a right to reply to anyone who's in there. We wrote to Mazza Mahmood, we wrote to the Murdoch press, we wrote to the police who'd sometimes connived with that. We wrote to all sorts of people. And when we wrote to the police, their immediate reaction was to go and raid the home of an ex-police officer who they thought had helped provide us with material. I'm not going to say whether he did or he didn't, but a whole load of cops went around and raided his home the next morning. We got huge letters in from Mazza Mahmood's lawyer and from Murdoch's lawyers. We got a letter from the Attorney General. The Attorney General got in touch with me. and said, you know, you can't do this. It's in contempt of court if you ran this film. And we wrote back saying, it's not in contempt of court. So he then wrote another letter saying, can you just not run the film? You know, because it would be embarrassing to Murdoch, who is very close to the Cameron government. And then as we got close, we get to what was the opening of that film, which is that Mazza went to court to try to get an injunction to stop us running the film. So he went to court. I had to go to court because as well as trying to get an injunction on the BBC, he also tried to get an injunction on me personally. We won the case, but he then appealed it. So that appeal took place on the Monday that we were supposed to run the film. We had to delay the film. We delayed it by a week. We got another letter from them just before we broadcast, which claimed to have new evidence to show that Mazza Mahmood was telling the truth. We had to look at that and delay it again. It finally went out 10 days after it originally should have. But it does, if they do try things like that, it does allow you to tell that story in that way. You know, this is the story that they don't want you to hear. So that's Fake Shake. And I'm just looking at my clock. I'd probably better get on to Savile at this point. So 10 years ago this year, Jimmy Savile died. I don't know if any of you have seen the Discovery Plus documentary, which I feature in, which came out a couple of weeks ago about all this. There's more to come. Netflix have got a huge two-parter coming out on the whole Savile scandal. And there are others that will be coming out during this year as it's the 10th anniversary of his death. And I was in a really strange position with Savile. I mean, I always say, look around you for stories, see what's around you. When I was a teenager, my aunt ran something that was called an approved school, which is a bit like a borstal. And that catered for mainly under 16-year-old girls. Because it's Britain, it was a very sort of strange institution which catered for highly intelligent girl criminals. And it was a stately home where the barons who took on King John at Magna Carta, where they stayed the night before they went to confront the king. It was this amazing stately home, but with bars on the upstairs windows. It was a very weird place. And my aunt ran that. And as a kid, as a teenager, I used to go there. And she used to organize fundraisers where she would invite celebrities along, and you'd see ex-film stars, minor royals, all sorts of people like that there. So it wasn't that surprising to see Jimmy Savile there. So I'm just going to play you the top of the Jimmy Savile panorama that we made. And I'll tell you when I'm going to share the screen. Let's just hope this works properly. And yeah, okay, I'm ready to share the screen now. So this is the opening of the Jimmy Savile panorama that was made in October 2012.
4 weeks ago, an ITV documentary broadcast allegations that one of this country's best-known TV stars, a man of the people, a friend of royalty, a devout Catholic who comforted the sick, was a child abuser. And he'd been allowed to get away with it unchecked for 50 years.
How did one man con the entire society?
Since being exposed, more than 200 people have claimed they were Savile's victims. Now, finally, their stories are being heard.
It is a bloody tragedy that this has happened when he's died. All this should have come out way before his death. But these girls are left with that legacy. And who's going to pay for that?
The NHS, the Home Office and local authorities may all face legal action for failing to protect Savile's many young victims.
It's growing by the minute. Initially it was a few and now they're coming in all the time and they're from the variety of different organisations.
But no organisation is under more fire and the one that made Jimmy Savile a star, the BBC.
Jimmy Savile's victims have faced years of pain. We owe it to them and to our audiences to understand how this could have happened and to make sure that everything we do ensures that nothing like this could ever happen again.
This is the worst crisis that I can remember in my nearly 50 years at the BBC.
Tonight, Panorama asks just how much BBC staff really knew about Savile's abuse.
After they had gone, he indicated to me in a nudge, nudge, wink, wink sort of way that he had just had sex with them. I didn't believe him.
And reveals the inside story of why a BBC investigation that could have exposed Savile almost a year ago was spiked instead.
We weren't asked to find more evidence or anything like that. We weren't asked to get more people on camera. We were told to stop working on the story.
It raises questions for the very top of the corporation.
You know, ever since the decision was taken to shelve our story, I've not been happy with public statements made by the BBC. I think they're very misleading about the nature of the investigation we were doing.
Okay, so over the years, I wondered more and more about Jimmy Savile, why he was at Duncroft. And in 1990, Lynn Barber, who at that time was probably the best interviewer in Fleet Street, went to interview him, and her article said something like, every journalist in Fleet Street tells me that he's a paedophile. And I immediately thought, God, was that what he was doing at Duncroft? Is that what was going on? And then again in the early 2000s, I came across Savile again when I was looking at paedophile priests in the Catholic Church, because Savile was a Catholic. He came up on the fringes of that, but I could never find any evidence, anything solid. So over the years, I then started looking at the early types of social media, like Friends Reunited. Duncroft, if you looked at that on Friends Reunited, there were hints that something had happened. And then in early 2011, I read an account by a woman called Karen Ward, who had been at Duncroft at the time. And her story would have sounded fantastical to anyone else reading it, you know, like film stars and minor royals and this stately home, but that was also a prison. But it also had that JS came to visit and what happened when he came to visit and how he took the girls out and assaulted them and took them to the BBC and they were assaulted there. And I knew who JS was. There was a mention of GG, who he went to see at Television Centre. That was obviously Gary Glitter. I knew that 95% of what she was saying was true. I only had to believe that little extra bit, and it wasn't difficult to believe. We tried that year to see if there was a way that we could get the story out. The problem was that all the victims were people who'd been in this Duncroft establishment, either as minor criminals or damaged people. He was very careful in the way he targeted people. He looked for people who would be difficult to give evidence against him. And we couldn't get it on. We also heard that there might have been a police investigation. We tried to get to the bottom of that, but we got nowhere by the time he died. But once he died, I said, look, I believe this is true. If we can get Karen to talk to us, it's no longer a matter of libel. If we believe her testimony, we can do this. And the BBC committed to that, and Newsnight committed to that, and we interviewed her. And then she convinced us, myself, Liz McKean, the late Liz McKean, who was also, you saw a clip of there, the camera operator, the researcher. And then as we drove away from doing that interview, we heard that the BBC was planning a Christmas dedicated to Jimmy Savile, to celebrating him. And we nervously laughed and said, well, that's not going to happen. You know, they'll be running our investigation. And as we went on, we found more and more information to back up what Karen had said to us. We found clips of a show called Clunk Click, which was a predecessor to Jim Will Fix It, Savile's big TV vehicle. And we could see the girls who we had photographs of at Duncroft at the time in the audience with Savile and Gary Glitter with their arms around them. It was standing up more and more. And then finally, we found out that there had been a police investigation of him. And at that point, it was decided to broadcast the programme. It was scheduled to go out in the first week of December. And it was obvious to us that the tributes weren't going to happen. We were going to expose him. We found more and more people who had been at Duncroft. We found out that similar things had gone on at Haute de la Garenne, at the other hospitals that Savile was working at. By the time we were ready to go with this programme, we thought that maybe 100 girls at 10 different establishments had been assaulted. That's a huge underestimate, but we already knew it was a major problem. And then about a week before broadcast, the BBC started to get cold feet. They suddenly said that Savile being a paedophile was not a story, that Savile being a paedophile at the BBC wasn't a story, that it would only be a story if there'd been a mix-up and a failure by the police. That would be a story, but nothing else would. And over the course of about a week, they killed the story. And myself and Liz McKean fought back, trying to get the story out there. One of our friends, Caroline Hawley, in fact, who had done the Bogus bomb detectors story with me, got to see the Director General and talked to the Director General of the BBC and told him about it and said, what's happening? Why aren't you broadcasting the investigation? But the whole thing was covered up. I mean, we know now that Savile the paedophile was known about at very high levels in the BBC through the 80s. Two heads of Radio 1 knew, and if they knew, you can be sure that other very senior people in the BBC would have known that. They would have certainly communicated that to the people in television who were running Jim Will Fix It. And yet nothing was done. And here we are now in 2011, the BBC has the chance to reveal the truth about Savile. It will be seen as being a bad organisation in the past, but it would be seen as being a positive organisation now that was trying to clean out the stables, instead of which they decided to cover it all up. Our story was blocked. Mark Williams-Thomas, who was an ex-policeman who we were working with, had all our information. We were going to interview him in the programme. He decided to go elsewhere and carry on doing this for ITV. And it took a very long time to come out. It was October the following year, 2012, that ITV broadcast exposure, which was based on our research and what we had done for the BBC. The BBC reacted to this by claiming that there'd been no investigation by us. And at that point, we had to say, myself and Liz, we will not go along with the lie. If there is any investigation into this, we will say we did the investigation, we were ready to go, we'd been promised that we could broadcast, and then that was blocked. We would not go along with this fiction that there had been no investigation. And over the course of the first few days, 3 days or so before it was broadcast, but while it was being press released, people didn't really know what to make of it. And then the ITV programme went out, Exposure, and all our colleagues in the BBC said, God, you were right, it's true. And they came around on side. But we now had the management to deal with who saw us as the enemy within. And there were some very fraught weeks. Panorama, Tom Giles, who's the editor of that, said to me, I don't understand. The BBC are putting out this line, and yet you're telling me something different. So I showed him all the emails and everything else that proved that we were telling the truth and the BBC was lying. And he decided that we had to do a panorama about this. Panorama that told the story of Savile, but also was honest about the BBC's own cover-up. And we then heard that the head of the BBC was going to be appearing in front of Parliament the following Monday. And at that point, Tom Giles said, we need to do a crash. He was going to be appearing the next Tuesday in front of Parliament. We need to do a crash that goes out on the Monday before the BBC appears in Parliament, so the truth is out there. And we did that. And everyone involved really with that panorama, which exposed what the BBC knew, ended up with their careers being blocked at the BBC and having to leave. And it was a very extreme situation where you're actually making a programme which is exposing your own organisation and the leadership of your own organisation. And that ultimately led to the resignation of the Director General of the BBC. It led to an inquiry which said that we had the story, but which didn't lay any blame on BBC bosses, said they must have pulled it for a good reason. They couldn't work out what that good reason was. You can draw your own conclusions. And that really is Savile's story. Now, I can see I'm starting to run out of time and I want to leave time for questions. So maybe I'll stop there and let people ask questions, either about what I've talked about today or anything else I've worked on that you're curious about.
Good evening. Thanks for that. Thank you so much, Meirion. Sorry for that rather convoluted handover. Yeah, that was absolutely brilliant. Troubling, but brilliant at the same time. Thank you so much for the work that you've done over the years. So we've got a few questions in. I just want to start off with a nice easy one for you. What is your favourite type of story? What is the sort of story that you go, yeah, I'm really going to get my handle on that, and I'd love to expose these people? What would that be?
I love it when it has an effect in the real world. So a couple of stories I didn't mention there. One was an investigation of Trafigura, which you mentioned in your introduction. That was a huge sort of secretive oil corporation which dumped deliberately a whole load of toxic waste in Africa in order to save money. They killed 16 people, 100,000 people got sick from this toxic waste, and it was purely to make more money on a deal. They had done a very dodgy crude distillation of very sulfurous oil. They'd sold the oil off and made a profit, and then discovered that it was going to cost an absolute fortune to get rid of the toxic waste. So rather than do that, they paid a fly tipper in Ivory Coast to go and fly tip this toxic waste in about a dozen different tankers all over Abidjan, the capital, and some of the poorest areas around the dump. That is a story that I like because we exposed real evil there. We cost them an awful lot of money, and some compensation was got, but not enough for those people who'd suffered from that. I also like it when the law changes. So we did another thing on vulture funds, and these were companies that were suing very poor countries. You know, when we were forgiving the debt of very poor countries, these vulture funds were coming along and screwing every penny out of them, finding odd bits of debt here and there, charging them 100 times what they'd paid for these bits of debt. And if the countries wouldn't pay up, they would sue them in the courts in London and bring everything to a halt, bring their foreign trade to a halt. They were forced at gunpoint to pay. And what we did in the run-in from 2006 through to 2010, at the start, only 2 or 3 MPs were interested. By the end, in the run-in to the 2010 election, all parties agreed to put through a bill which banned these people from operating in Britain. Same happened in Hong Kong. Chinese government put them out of action there. Same happened in America, where the president could rule that. And bizarrely, Bush actually brought action against them and stopped them operating in America. And that's partly because if you're a mega corporation like Exxon or somebody, these people are big, but they're tiny compared to you, and they're a real nuisance. You're trying to buy oil from a country, and this country's tied up in the courts and so on. But yeah, I like stories that have an effect in the real world.
Excellent. Okay, cheers. How does your work help promote skepticism? Do you think it has any reference to skepticism at all?
Yeah, I mean, the bogus bomb detector is a classic example. It's black boxism, isn't it? If we have people who, I mean, the real fact is that 99% of the population don't know how a mobile phone works. They don't know how a computer works. It's a black box that is into all intents magic. So it's very easy for people to come along with another magic box and say there's some magic electronics in this, it can do this, it can do that. We really have to be critical thinkers about everything. And in that case, the actual process was one of how do we find evidence? You know, what can we get? Obviously, we'd have liked to get the actual, you know, bogus bomb detector. They weren't going to sell us one, and frankly, we didn't have 40 grand in the petty cash anyhow. But eventually, by finding somebody who made the cards for it, which were claimed to be the key thing, you then find a way through. Trafigura, the key thing there was working our way through what the chemical composition was of the waste and finding records of that, and then going to chemists and working out what the effect of that would be. It's very much the sort of approach that we use as skeptics to go through stuff. And there are many, many more, you know, obviously I did a lot of stings on homeopaths and faith healers. I'd love to show you the one that was disrupted by naked cyclists, but we haven't got time. We were doing a doorstep in central London. One of these faith healers who claimed you could grow your leg back if, you know, if you'd had it blown off in Afghanistan, but who made millions. She was American and she had a lot of followers, and we'd got secret filming of all this stuff. But then we wanted to do a doorstep. We're in Lincoln's Inn Field at the weekend. LSE had rented her a room to give her credibility. They'll do anything for money. And as she emerged, we sprang out of our car only to have 2,000 naked cyclists ride past us, the key moment. So we couldn't get across to where she was. So in the end, I ended up having to run after her and then get socked by her husband, who turned out to be an ex-American footballer or something, who but clocked me on camera, which is good. It's always good if that happens on camera.
Yeah.
But yes.
Oh, cool. Alison Metcalf's asking a question. Do you think Savile or the cover-up of Savile could happen again, or do you think the culture has changed enough in the BBC?
I'm not going to speak for the BBC specifically, but much more generally than that, the key thing I thought we needed to bring in after Savile, which we campaigned for and made programmes advocating, is mandatory reporting of child abuse. At the moment, it's still the case that if you're a headmaster or the head of a corporation like the BBC, the easiest thing to do is to turn a blind eye or give a nice, you know, letter of recommendation, a reference to that person to get them out of your head.
Ship them off, yeah.
And I don't know if you saw the other day, it was a story in The Guardian, I think, about, it wasn't sexual abuse, but it was physical abuse, a guy who liked beating kids. And what happened in the end was Winchester College found out that he'd been doing this to their kids, and they sent him a note saying, do not come anywhere near our kids ever again. They didn't report him to the police or anything like that. And that is still culturally the case until you have a position that if you're head of the BBC and you know that Jimmy Savile is, you know, abusing kids, if you're head of a hospital, you know, if you're head of any organisation and you cover that up, you should go to prison. And it seems such a simple law change to have.
Yeah.
That would change attitudes because you make the top people responsible.
Yeah, good, exactly. Do you have any concerns about journalism and the truth movement? I mean, the people who, you know, has just called fake news and everything. Do you have any concerns that journalism itself has been devalued so much by people just not understanding and not realising the work that goes into these investigations?
Yeah, I mean, it is a real problem. I mean, there's a good side to citizen journalism. And, you know, there are many people in the skeptic movement who become sort of citizen journalists and so on. And that's great. But this mood that anyone's opinion is worth as much as facts is absolute antithesis of everything that skeptic movement believes in. You know, it's facts, 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 and you test those facts. And sure, you might have an opinion to start with, and you might try and prove a thesis or whatever, but you've got to keep going at facts. I mean, that has been another real problem with the whole child abuse thing, that you end up with two wings. One that believed that every allegation of child abuse against everyone was true, and one that believed that no allegations against senior people were true. And they both came at it from that angle, rather than going on the facts of the cases. We have to be fact-driven.
I saw somebody commenting on a forum the other day that complaining about the BBC is biased because it demands two separate sources for each story.
Yeah.
You know, what is just normal journalism where you would try and get, I presume you would normally get two separate independent sources to verify it. But they thought that was evidence of bias.
Or you have a document and you have a person, and the two, you put the two together, or whatever.
Of course.
I mean, sometimes that was not as strong as it appeared. So, for instance, the BBC used to have that rule for, you know, stories coming out of Africa or somewhere that you needed two sources. So you'd have the Reuters stringer and the AP stringer both writing stories saying it's true, so you've got your two sources, but actually quite often it was the same person.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It's not really two independent sources.
It's getting that primary source, isn't it? Yeah. I was going to say about Savile, one other thing I wanted to bring you back on to there is, can you imagine any other media organisation doing an expose of themselves in the way that you did in that Panorama programme?
No.
I certainly can't imagine it.
No,
but
absolutely not. And it was a remarkable couple of weeks. So, you know, we were on the same floor as senior management in Panorama, and yet senior management regarded us as the enemy, absolutely the enemy, and tried everything. They tried to stop me and Liz being part of the programme. They tried to suppress our emails, but it was too late. We'd already given them to Panorama. They banned me from the edit suite. Well, that was fine. You know, I was just working in the office at Panorama on the scripts. I wasn't actually in the edit suite. And, you know, there was massive pressure put on us that, you know, we would never work for the BBC again if we, you know, we would be sacked if we took part in this Panorama. And in fact, Tom Giles, who was the editor, when he announced that we were doing a crash on this, said, anyone who volunteers for this, you won't sleep for a week and your BBC career will be fucked. And he was right on both counts.
So I've just got a final question, which some people wanted to ask was, what are your thoughts on Levison?
Without stage 2, it never really got anywhere. You know, it had to get to stage 2. It's true that it made a difference perhaps on phone hacking and things like that, but actually what really made the difference there were the civil cases and the vast amounts of money that had to be paid out. It had negative effects as well. So on things like bogus bomb detectors, I had very good contacts in the police, particularly in city police, who wanted our information, wanted to work with us, etc. After Levison, that became very difficult. So I went back into the city police HQ after Levison about something completely different. It was actually about it was about the sort of gambling rackets and so on, and binary options, and the fake deals there. And we went in to see somebody on their fraud operation, and there were several police officers who went to wave at me, who I knew in there, and then they just put their hands down and turned around and walked away because they couldn't be seen anywhere near a journalist. I mean, there was nothing wrong with that. What was wrong was journalists, particularly from places like the Mail and the Murdoch Press, bribing police officers for information. And there was a culture of that. You know, they used to call it big drinks. You know, that the journalists offer big drinks to a couple.
And they get the phone call, there are celebrities being arrested for drink driving or something like that, rather than anything that's really worthwhile. Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you so much. Before we go, is there anything that you want to plug? Any Twitter handles or anything like that?
Well, I mean, my Twitter handle is @Meirion tweets, but you can look at it or not look at it.
And lastly, where's the cat? We need to see Scout. Just can we see Scout?
Okay, let's see if she'll cooperate. You're going to cooperate? Come on then. Oh, come on then. Oh, right, okay. I'll stop it. And so do you want to actually come out of Zoom or not?
You are looking very Max Headroomish.
I'm not actually sure how to do that. You mean just turn it off at the bottom? Yeah, stop video. Sorry, yeah. Okay. All right. Come and have a look. Oh dear. Not very happy about being picked up for a second time.
Hello, Scott. Good evening to the cat.
No, not happy.
Right, sorry about that. My apologies. Sorry. Really, I think that's about all we've got time for tonight. So thank you again, Meirion Jones. Right, so we hope you've enjoyed these events, but obviously we'd much rather we were back in the usual 23 events live at the Banshee and normal. And until we can get back safely and properly, please get vaccinated. Please keep safe, and hopefully we'll see you all again soon. And for now, a final thanks to Meirion Jones for his fantastic talk, and good night.